Annenberg Media.
By the National Science Foundation, America's investment in the future. By the American Society for Microbiology. And by the Office of Biological and Environmental Research of the United States Department of Energy. Additional funding was provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. This program has been made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Ancient Indian cultures felt spiritually linked to animals for providing them with life's bare necessities, food and clothing. Pacific Northwest Indians made totems to appease the animal spirits. A hierarchy of animals were venerated by the native peoples for behavioral traits the tribe admired. The salmon, their main source of protein, was treated with the reverence befitting a creature they believed offered itself up willingly to ensure the tribe's survival. But there are no totems to any of the microbes. And yet, for every culture that has ever existed, or ever will, it is the microbes' astonishing abilities to chemically transform the world that make life possible for all other forms of life.
Beautiful, isn't it? Crystal clear water teeming with trout. At least that's what they tell me. No bites yet. But the pristine lake you see now was a reeking quagmire of sulfurous mud and woody debris in the spring of 1980. And before that, well, it didn't even exist.
Mount St. Helens erupted with a magnitude 5.1 earthquake that released the largest landslide in recorded history. The resulting mud flows dammed up this river valley. Once the dust settled, there was a lake here where there hadn't been before.
But it was also a complex community of microbes that helped rehabilitate Coldwater Lake here. It was the microbes that processed the sudden infusion of nutrients and metals and caused suspended debris in the water to precipitate and settle to the bottom, thus paving the way for an ecosystem that'll support stocked rainbow trout.
And so it goes, the world over. Microbes transform and regulate ecosystems large and small. An ecosystem is a physical environment along with all of the organisms that live there. Over the next half hour, you'll see a variety of these environments which depend upon microbial cycling of nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, and other essential mineral nutrients. Long before there were animals or plants or fish or insects, when dinosaurs were still 1 billion years in the future, microbes transformed the Earth's atmosphere from an unbreathable mixture of noxious gases to the oxygen-based air used by all the life forms that were to follow. Today, microbes in the ocean affect the temperature of the planet. Ocean algae produce a sulfur compound, which escapes from the ocean into the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, the sulfur particles cause moisture in the air to form cloud droplets. With many droplets, we see a very white cloud. With just a few, it looks dark. The degree of whiteness affects how much of the sun's light and heat are reflected from Earth back into space, one of the things that controls the Earth's temperature. Ongoing cycles such as this sustain life on our planet, an ecosystem sometimes referred to as Biosphere 1. But what might happen if humans attempted to recreate this success in a custom-built, enclosed environment? In Arizona in the mid-1980s, scientists built a small version of Earth. A tiny ocean, streams, grasslands, even a desert, sealed by glass and steel. Eight men and women were to live here, physically isolated from the outside, for 2 years. Biosphere 2 was a complete world. There were many species of plants and animals, 7 ecological zones. A recipe for life. Their goal was to create a self-sustaining living environment. If successful, they would prove the possibility of sustaining life on other planets, such as Mars. In August of 1991, it was all ready. The 8 biospherians were about to breathe their last air from the outside world. The concept for the Biosphere Life Support System was straightforward: total recycling. Everything needed for life, food, oxygen, materials of all kinds, would be used and reused. Waste would be recovered and recycled. Biosphere 2 would be completely self-contained, with nothing needed from the outside world. The concept is sound, as demonstrated by this unique airtight globe called an ecosphere. Inside, water, shrimp, algae, and a mix of aquatic bacteria can survive and thrive for years. Nutrients are used and reused. Waste from one species is what another needs. In an endless cycle, all the nutrients for all the creatures are provided for. Biosphere 2 set out to do the same thing on a larger scale. For months, all was well. The food consumed was grown within the biosphere. The biospherians went about their work. All ecological zones flourished. But, unexpectedly, oxygen levels began to fall. One species after another died. The birds disappeared, then the frogs. The biospherians found it increasingly hard to breathe. Urgent efforts at a remedy failed, and in desperation, oxygen was pumped in from outside. The sacred seal was broken. Work inside continued, but the major feature of the grand experiment was gone. Many explanations were proposed for the dramatic loss of oxygen. Plant growth in Biosphere 2 was less abundant than normal, so oxygen from photosynthesis was less than expected. But this explained only a fraction of the loss. The suspicion arose that a major part of the loss was due to the tiniest creatures. That Biosphere 2 had failed in large part because of microbes. The question is, why? What went wrong? We know that the oxygen levels dropped by almost a third in only a few months, causing the extinction of many species within Biosphere 2. Yet a conscious effort had been made to introduce plant, animal, and insect species that would successfully form a food web, a web of life. But microbial species were added almost inadvertently, most of them, like Earth's, virtually unknown. The microbes did what they're supposed to do. We created an imbalance by overfeeding them. Other factors probably came into play, but there is a strong suspicion that in significant part, one of humankind's most ambitious experiments was brought down, in effect, by a compost heap. Over-fertilization of the soil created a microbial feeding frenzy. Reproduction increased dramatically to billions of trillions. This impacted the oxygen cycle. One microbe hardly makes a difference, but trillions of rapidly reproducing bacteria consumed a huge amount of the oxygen within the enclosed ecosystem. Was Biosphere 2 a failure? Yes and no.
Biosphere 2 gave us an opportunity to begin developing ideas that we need to understand how our own biosphere works in detail. Can we afford not to understand what the microorganisms are and what they do? Up till now, we've gotten by without understanding them, but we take for granted that Earth's biosphere will continue to hum along into the future without the sorts of significant problems that cause almost devastating trouble for Biosphere 2. Can we permit them to remain a mystery before we begin predicting how our own biosphere will respond to human influences? We have to find out what these organisms do. Without the microorganisms, there could be no plant life, there could be no animal life. We would disappear.
The diversity of life is manifest all along America's eastern seaboard. Thousands of miles of coastline along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast are shallow marshes and swamps. An incredibly productive nursery for sea life, insects, and birds.
But without microorganisms, this would be little more than a sterile sea of grass. Every food web originates with a producer, a plant that converts sun energy into food energy. Now, these vast seas of marsh grass aren't being grazed by animals. This grass can only be broken down by microbes. It is the microbes who set the cycling of energy and sustain the animals that thrive in this ecosystem. Though untypical, these ecosystems are among the most productive on the planet, pound for pound, rivaling a managed Iowa cornfield.
But you don't have to take my word for it. That's Professor Hans Perl of the University of North Carolina's Institute of Marine Sciences. He's an expert on the ecology of estuaries and the role microbes play in them.
I think we all accept the idea that these estuaries are great for lots of different forms of life and that it's a very rich type of an ecosystem, but it is surprising that it all kind of rests on the back of microorganisms. How does that work exactly?
Well, basically, the microbes are the processors of the organic matter that's formed here. You see this vast sea of marsh grass, which has a lot of carbon in it, but it doesn't have much nitrogen and other nutritional elements in it. So the bacteria have to act as an intermediate to make all this food out here available for the rest of the food chain. And they do so by decomposing it, first of all. And as the material becomes decomposed and can break down or form what we call detritus, particulate matter in the water, the bacteria not only make the organic matter available to organisms that would consume this organic matter, but they also add nitrogen, because they can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and add it to the detritus and make a more complete diet, basically, for the next level in the food web, which would be larval organisms, the invertebrates that you see attached to the stalks here of the Spartina, larval fish, insects, and ultimately birds and fish that feed on them.
When you look closely at the Spartina, I've noticed that below water level it has a film on it, sort of a dirty looking film. Is that where the microbes are at work?
That's where the action starts. That film will go right up to the tidal line, and what that film represents is the oozing out of carbon compounds from the Spartina and the bacteria being attracted by that and starting the process of decomposition and converting that carbon into a more useful source. Secondly, they add nutritional value to this material out here. You have to realize that there's an awful lot of carbon out here, but very little nitrogen. And nitrogen is a limiting factor in coastal systems. In other words, it takes nitrogen to produce a full diet, essentially, or a good food source. And there are bacteria which break down, or are associated with bacteria that break down this detritus, that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So only they can bring in this source of nitrogen to supplement the carbon.
Right.
So the bacteria are sort of forming this extra function here to enhance the dietary completeness.
A microbe's definition of an ecosystem is not necessarily the same as ours. While humans and microbes exist side by side in many habitats, you might be surprised to learn that many complex microbial ecosystems exist within the bodies of living animals. For example, a cycling of nutrients similar to that in the marsh grass is at work right here inside old Bessie.
From the perspective of a microbe, she's just the delivery system that brings cellulose to a community of microorganisms residing in her stomach, or rumen.
Actually, the cow in the marsh are very different. The cow's rumen is anaerobic. The salt marsh is both aerobic and anaerobic, and the microbes are different in each. But the overall outcome is the same. Microbes process the food. Herbivores eat grass, but none of them can actually digest cellulose. For that, they rely on internal ecosystems of cellulose-loving microbes. What Bessie and her herbivoral relatives live on are microbial byproducts. Without the microorganisms working in concert within the bovine digestive tract, cattle would be unable to convert grass to protein, which means no hamburgers and no cheese to melt over them. And without the microbial cycles that take place in the marsh grass, much of the seafood caught in coastal areas would not exist. Microbial relationships impact our everyday existence, in some cases by helping to provide us with a source of food. But when the microbial equilibrium of an ecosystem is upset, the outcome can adversely affect our quality of life.
We used to dump our waste in these rivers. And as distasteful as that seems now, there was a time when that was a perfectly natural thing to do. Microbes in the river could break down the waste without disrupting the river's ecosystem. Of course, that was back in the days before we started living in such concentrated numbers.
When too much waste is released into a river, the ecosystem is overwhelmed. Microbes use oxygen to break down the material. In this river, the microbes were metabolizing so much waste, they were using up all the dissolved oxygen in the water. Fish suffocated. And a different river ecosystem was created, one without fish. Through the use of primary and secondary sewage treatment, this river has been rehabilitated. But humans continue to negatively impact ecosystems simply through our waste product disposal practices. Our deepening understanding of the chemical conversation within and among microbes is enabling us to devise some remarkable ways to clean up after ourselves, or rather, for microbes to clean up after us. Given time and the right conditions, microbes can degrade almost anything. Microbiologist Terry Hazen is using this microbial ability to help solve the solid waste problem. In a typical garbage dump, the most common waste is organic material like household trash and paper. It degrades very slowly.
Everybody's heard the stories about being able to read newspapers that have been in a landfill for 50 years, okay? That's because there's not enough water there, there's not enough oxygen to get the biodegradation.
At this Georgia dump, Hazen and a local contractor are pumping air and water into the refuse. The result? The resident microbes thrive. They multiply rapidly. As their numbers increase, they degrade more trash faster.
It's so much better, such a better way to deal with our waste problems. I hope this spreads exponentially.
We can utilize resources generated doing this operation to close the loop on the solid waste issue and leave that waste generated during our generation stable, so that the next generation doesn't have to pick up that cost and add it to its operating cost.
Yeah, I think this is going to spread throughout the country. I am just super excited about this. What a tremendously active microbial environment this has become. It gets up over 140 degrees, 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's steamy. All of that is the microbes degrading so much material so fast that they're creating this heat.
Yeah, I was just looking at it. It's got a good smell too. Yeah. Yeah, it got a funky smell. It's got a good cook smell.
You can actually use your senses to see how well this is working, because the smell is much lower than if we had fresh garbage. This has just sort of a musty odor, whereas over here, where they haven't been using this process, the smell is so overwhelming that it'll make you throw up.
With some extra air and water, microbes degrade the dump's organic waste in a fraction of the normal time.
So we're going from 30, 40 years or more, perhaps, down to just a couple of years, or maybe in some cases just a few months.
A faster cleanup also saves money. Hazen's microbial method benefits our budget, as well as the air, soil, and groundwater. By harnessing the power of the microbe, we have at our disposal remarkable tools with abilities we are only now beginning to discover. Abilities we've witnessed in nature, in ecosystems as diverse as the wilderness surrounding Mount St. Helens to the rumen of a dairy cow. Put simply, the vast majority of microbes busy themselves with browsing for food, and in the process, they recycle elements such as nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, sulfur, and almost all metals, making them usable for other forms of life. They transform and maintain the ecosystems that all living things depend on for survival.
Well, skunked again. Oh, I hope that doesn't get infected. Which reminds me, as we'll see in our next episode, in the case of a small minority of microbes, our efforts to control them has less to do with putting them to work for us than with making sure they don't cause disease if they get inside of us.
Annenberg Media.
By the National Science Foundation, America's investment in the future. By the American Society for Microbiology. And by the Office of Biological and Environmental Research of the United States Department of Energy. Additional funding was provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. This program has been made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
For information about this and other Annenberg Media programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.